25 years. He was martyred in Rome. He was martyred near where St. Peter's Basilica now is, which is why it was built there. And he had successors, Linus, Anacletus, Clement. Sometimes you hear them in the Litany of the Saints. So it wasn't, the church in Rome was started by St. Peter. It was where the Roman Empire was, or the head of, the capital of the Roman Empire. And St. Peter himself was appointed by Christ to try and hold the church together. When the popes make decisions, in a sense they're absolute monarchs, but in another sense they can really do nothing on their own, because they're always trying to hold everything together, and they're bound by tradition and by the decisions that previous popes and councils have made. So in a sense they're absolute, in a sense they can do nothing on their own. Kind of an interesting combination. So anyway, moving from the 1st century, we have lists of bishops in various cities in the early church history of the church, and these indicate a succession, because the bishops or the apostles didn't start a church just for when they were living. Of course, they would hope it would continue. And in Rome, there was a shrine that was known as the Trophy of Gaius. And the Christians would go and they would use that as kind of a marker for where St. Peter was buried. They knew where St. Peter was buried, but the Christianity was illegal, so how do you honor St. Peter? Well, you say, well, go to where this particular Roman monument was. And this was on Vatican Hill, near where St. Peter was killed. And in the first several centuries, how did we come up with new popes? Well, in other places, the people and the clergy would choose their bishops, and Rome was probably no different. We don't know exactly how it was done in the first couple hundred years, but we do know in other places that the local rulers would interfere in elections. And in a way that still happens today in places like China, where the government comes in and says, we want to have our bishops in there, so that they do what we want them to do. That's always been a problem for the church. So Christianity has always tried to sort of try and maintain some independence, and having the papal elections done by people inside the church, and what eventually became the College of Cardinals, was one way for Christianity to take the appointment of the bishops away from the local rulers. An important date for Christianity was when it was legalized in the Roman Empire by Constantine the Great in 313, which is almost 300 years after Christ, about 250 or so years. And that changed the nature of Christianity, because now it was legal, now it could spread. And Constantine and his son built the original St. Peter's Basilica to honor St. Peter. It actually isn't the cathedral, the big building in Rome, isn't the cathedral of Rome. St. Peter's Basilica is a church that was meant really as a pilgrim destination for people to come and honor St. Peter. And the Cathedral of Rome is called St. John Lateran. So Christianity continued to grow. The Roman Empire fell apart. And in 452, Pope Leo the Great was an important ruler, or important pope, because when the Roman Empire was falling apart, he sort of became the leader of Rome. Wasn't your grandson Leo the Great?
No, he was supposed to be, and he ended up going back to Gregory the Great.
Oh, okay. And we were talking about this before class, in 533. There was a pope who was a man was appointed pope, and his name was Mercury, because it was the Roman Empire, and he was basically named after a Roman god. So he didn't want a pope named after a Roman god, so he changed his name to John. And that was sort of that was the first papal name change. And it continued from there. So you have all these little traditions we keep picking up through the history of the church. 7th and 8th century, the Byzantine emperors, I mentioned before, rulers would try to interfere. Well, the Byzantine emperors tried to demand the right to approve the papal appointments. But the church never formally said, yes, you can do that. They would always try and maybe find a diplomatic way around it. And then we have information 769, there was a decree on papal elections. Only Roman clergy could vote, no laity or rulers. And the word cardinal, if you've ever heard that, it actually means hinge, which sounds like kind of an odd thing, but they would use the word hinge the same way we would use the word key. The hinge was the men that the Roman Church turned on. So these were the key people, the key clergy in Rome were the cardinals. And originally there were only, I have here 28 cardinal priests, 7 cardinal bishops, and 18 cardinal deacons. That was the original makeup. And through the Middle Ages, this group of people continued to elect popes, and sometimes there were many deadlocks because there weren't a whole lot of them, and they couldn't agree. I don't know if I have it in here, but there was one time where they met, and they couldn't agree. So they were in a church, and they couldn't agree, and the people got antsy. They wanted them to come up with a decision, so they took the roof off the church to try and force them to make a decision. And so by the 10th century, name changes became common. There's never been a Peter II. And Vicki actually brought this. These are all the popes. There's quite a few of them. There's never been a Peter II because people want to honor Peter, effectively. And also there's a legend of when we get a Peter II, the world's going to come to an end. So that wouldn't be good either. In 1059, there was another election decreed by Nicholas II. Again, it kind of formalized how the Pope was going to be elected. In 1179, it was decided you needed a 2/3 majority, so most of the bishops and most of the cardinals needed to agree. You couldn't just have like a 51%. And at 1241 here, there's a conclave where there was a deadlock, and so they locked the cardinals in the church and said, you can't come out until you come up with a decision. And that's where the word conclave comes from. It means with key. Then I mentioned, well, then there's 1269. That's the time they took the roof off the church. More rules were made in 1274. The important period was in the 13 and early 1400s when, we think of Rome as being this big, beautiful city, but by the late Middle Ages, it had begun to fall apart. And so the popes had basically a city in southern France called Avignon. And they left Rome, the Pope left Rome for Avignon. And that, because it would be a better place to rule the church from. But that created a problem because they were the bishop of Rome. The whole idea of having a pope was that it was descended from Peter, who was the bishop of Rome. And how can the bishop of Rome not be in Rome? How can he be in France? So that caused a great schism where the Romans appointed their own bishop and their own pope. So we had 2 popes. And so there was a great deal of controversy about that. And then people would try and come up with a compromise. Then there'd be 3 popes. And Have you ever heard of Catherine of Siena? She was this great medieval saint, a woman in a town in northern Italy. And she basically went to Rome and demanded that they solve this problem. And, you know, she was successful, actually.
She went to Avignon and talked to the Pope, didn't she?
Yeah.
Told him to get his butt back to where he belonged.
So 1417, the papacy was reunited in Rome. And so one of the things the popes did after all this chaos is they wanted to build up Rome, because the popes at the time, and still out there, they were important people. They were the leading person in Rome. So, you know, Rome's a wreck. You know, let's have some urban renewal. And so they started doing things like in 1506, Julius II decided to demolish the original St. Peter's Basilica and build a new church. And that sounds like a great idea. We've had the 500th anniversary of that, April 18th, the cornerstone was April 18th, 1506. And at the time, you know, it took several hundred years to build a church. Well, although that might sound like a good idea, it caused problems later. At the bottom of page 5, you'll notice a picture of a plaza outside of St. Peter's. You can see the dome of St. Peter's on the left-hand side, and there's an obelisk that was actually taken by the Romans from Egypt and put in basically a racetrack they had in Rome, and that's where St. Peter was martyred. So St. Peter may have seen this obelisk just before he died. Probably did. So then when they built St. Peter's, they kept the obelisk. So I mentioned that they started building a new St. Peter. Well, you need money for that, don't you? So let's sell indulgences. And so that caused a lot of problems when Martin Luther and the Northern Europeans objected to that. You know, they had a point, but unlike the earlier controversies in the church, you didn't have a ruler at the time who could pull everything back together and say, you know, let's everybody get together and have just one church. That's why you have all these Protestant denominations today. So 1521, Leo excommunicated Martin Luther. He thought he was solving the problem, but he really didn't. And then after that, for several hundred years, up until maybe 150 years ago, monarchs across most of Europe, you think, well, there's very few monarchies today, so you would think monarchies were dying out, but really they were becoming even more powerful. Monarchs had the idea that their power came from God, that they had the divine right of kings. So the idea is God must have willed this man to be the king. Well, you know, if you think that, then that monarch gets to decide the religion. And he gets to decide how everything is done in this country. So he had various monarchs. Henry VIII in England broke off from Rome because he's the monarch and he can decide what the Church of England is like. Or Ferdinand in Spain, he persecuted the Muslims and he kicked out the Jews because everybody needs to be Catholic because he's Catholic. And they didn't go to Rome and say, can we do this? They said, no, I'm the king. I can decide these things. So, you know, the Catholic Church has always had this relationship with politics, where it tries to preserve its independence, but then politicians either go too far and trying to say, you know, and using religion for their own purposes, or on the other hand, completely ignoring religion. So then I mentioned 1534, Henry VIII breaks with Rome, which calls in shortly thereafter the Council of Trent, where the church tried to respond to many of the problems that were brought, that Martin Luther addressed, and tried to cure abuses within the church. And also,
What caused Henry VIII to break from the Church of Rome?
he wanted more wives. He had, I think, at the time, the church would try and annul marriages for rulers. And because they figured, well, a ruler needs to have an heir, otherwise the country would be in chaos. So they would give annulments to a ruler for one reason or another. Well, Henry VIII, I think on his third wife, was Catherine of Aragon, and he decided, no, I want another wife still. He wound up having, I think, 6 wives. So he kept divorcing them in the church. After 3, the church said, no, you're not doing this anymore. And he said, forget you, I'm starting my own church. So,
And that was all to produce an heir?
the problem with Catherine of Aragon, I think it was, maybe it wasn't. Anyway, the problem with his third wife is she gave him heirs. They were all girls. So he had 3 girls. So maybe if he had waited a little longer, he would have had a boy, but he didn't want to wait. I don't know.
Well, didn't he have Edward, who died when he was like 6 or 8 or something like that? He ended up having a boy, and
Oh, yeah.
he died, no?
Yeah. Was that for a later wife? Though?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because Anna Boleyn gave him a girl. I don't think Catherine of Aragon could have children, but,
Didn't they have a girl? Didn't they have a girl that lived?
Yeah.
Henry and
did
Catherine?
they? Yeah, see, I can't remember. I know Anne Boleyn had a girl. Maybe that was Mary and Elizabeth, because
Yeah, because Anne had
Mary was
Elizabeth, right?
Catholic and Elizabeth was
Protestant.
Protestant. Yeah, Church of England.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting stuff.
And it's unfortunate too, because if you look at England today, it's really lost most of their religion. They practice religion very little. It's been in so much chaos over the years. So also about the same time, they hired Michelangelo to design a new St. Peter's. And so on page 6, you can see a nicer picture of the dome and all of that. So 1555, Marcellus II was the last pope to keep his baptismal name. 1566, the pope was Pius V, and he was a Dominican. And if you've ever seen a Dominican priest, they always wear white. So he wore white. And I don't know, popes have worn white ever since. So if you see a pope wearing white, it goes back to 1566. And then there's some changes, the number of cardinals was increased. 1591, Pope Gregory XIV banned choosing a pope by adoration. What that means is a party would want a certain man to be named pope. So before there was even an election, they would come in and somebody would say, I don't know, Vicky the First, he's pope. And, hey, and everyone, what's going on? And, well, so they banned trying to do that. Also banned betting on elections. People used to do that. Actually, some of the best information we would have on who might be pope in some of these older days came from the bookies.
This is where we get all these records from. People just think, oh, it's just in the Bible. No, there's all kinds of little tidbits like that that you get information from. It's so interesting.
And then in the 1600s, the new St. Peter's was finally completed, so it took over 100 years. It used to take a long time to build a church. And then there were new limits on the number of cardinals and some other adjustments to the election process. Pope Urban VIII, he hired an architect named Bernini to build a colonnade outside the Vatican. So again, if you ever seen the Vatican, it has this big, nice plaza, it has these columns going around it, and he was the one that designed that. And shortly thereafter, there was a movement called the Enlightenment, in which many intellectuals, they wanted to reunite Europe because you had Protestants and you had Catholics. Well, how do we put people back together? We're just going to use reason. So their idea was everything would be a matter of just rationale and so forth. So unfortunately, that caused the French Revolution. So instead of just uniting everybody with reason, we wound up with even more division. And the French Revolution tried to abolish the church and start a cult of reason. And if you go back, even communism is an Enlightenment movement, or national socialism, things like that. But the French Revolution, it really put a lot of stress on the papacy because, the papacy it was held in a great deal of respect until the Reformation. But then the Reformation was in Northern Europe. When the Enlightenment came along, you had rulers in the French Revolution and then Napoleon who really, in a sense, weren't Catholic in any real sense. So 1799, Pius VI was arrested by the French and he died in exile. And the papacy, you might say, barely survived that period. It was the Emperor of Austria who allowed a conclave in Venice to choose the next pope. Of course, in another sense, you might say that the Holy Spirit wanted it to survive. So Pius VIII tried to make a peace with Napoleon, and he returned to Rome, and he did some other things. In the late 1800s, Pius IX started what was called the First Vatican Council. Maybe you've heard of the second one, which is more recent, but the first one was in the 1800s. They tried to respond to many of these challenges that all this rationalism brought about. And then go ahead another 100 years, John the 23rd in the 1960s started the Second Vatican Council. And this was in, the 1900s was a very turbulent decade. And there was not only a lot of division within the church, but you think about 2 world wars, just the massive amount of killing and the rise of communism. So John the 23rd called the Second Vatican Council, and he's the one who allowed English to be used in the Mass, and he supported dialogue with other religions. In the earlier part, I talked about how the church now sees itself as the church subsists in the Roman Catholic Church. This is different than an interpretation that would say, the Catholic Church alone has truth. So 1975, you had Paul VI, and he made a number of changes. He expanded the number of cardinals so that you could have third world countries. And if you look at the papal conclaves more recently, it's like people from all over the world. Really, up until the middle of the 20th century, you didn't have that. It was very difficult to get to Rome from even the United States. And also only cardinals under 80 were eligible to vote. So you didn't have some 100-year-old cardinals. And John Paul II, he was elected in 78, and he really changed the way people saw the papacy, because until John Paul II, you would rarely see the Pope on television or traveling around. I mean, once in a while the Pope would go to New York, but people generally saw the church through their local pastor. With John Paul, I think he gave more of an internationalist image to the church. So I have 2005. This has probably changed somewhat since then, but 15 years ago there were 38 Italian cardinals. It used to be almost all the cardinals were Italian. Then there were 57 from other European countries, 25 Central and South America, 24 North America, 18 Asia, 16 Africa. And in 2013, Benedict XVI became the first pope to resign his office since 1415.
Why did he resign?
He was getting old. He didn't think he could do the job. John Paul had the idea that you're a pope forever. And he was going to fight on to the end. And I mean, there's certain advantages to that. I think he saw himself as a symbol to older people who, were also ill and maybe near the end of their lives. And he was saying, you don't give up at any point. I think Benedict looked at that and he said, we would have really done better maybe for the last 10 years of John Paul's tenure if we had a pope who was more physically fit and could. I mean, there were scandals in the very end of John Paul's tenure. So then we had, of course, a conclave, and John Paul had built a hotel at the Vatican, and that hotel is now used to house the cardinals when they come in, so they don't have to sleep in cots inside the Sistine Chapel. And once a cardinal's in a conclave, he can't have contact with the outside world. They're in there, they, of course, have food and so forth, but they have to stay in there until they elect the Pope. And the cardinals swear an oath to uphold the rules, and concaves only last in the 20th century about 3 days, that's the average. So, and there's also a saying that he who enters the conclave as Pope leaves as a cardinal, which means if somebody comes in there and everybody thinks he's the leading candidate, he probably isn't going to be elected. The cardinals will gather, they will talk about what the church needs and about who would make a good pope. So they're not just talking about politics, they're trying to figure out what the church really needs. And so I know when John Paul was elected, he was elected because communism was a big challenge. And they thought, well, if we get somebody who knows about this, who's really suffered under not only communism but under Nazism, then he can speak more to the world. And then he was generally considered, he was considered a great pope. And then Benedict, I think, was elected because he was a great theologian. And they thought, well, okay, I mean, John Paul worked out pretty well. Benedict seems like the obvious next person. But then when Benedict decided to step down, what I've heard is that the cardinals were thinking, well, we want somebody who can reform some of the bureaucracy of the Vatican, because it was getting very cumbersome. So they brought in Francis for that. So I don't know if you remember the papal election, but once a pope is elected, if he accepts, he's pope. That's it. There's no other test you can give him. The dean of the college of cardinal asks him what name he takes. He goes to the balcony and he gives his blessing and he's introduced. And then there's an installation mass a few days later. And the Pope is called the Pontifex Maximus. If you want to know where the word pontiff comes from, it's Latin for great bridge builder. Like if you've ever heard of a pontoon boat, well, that's how Romans built bridges. So Pontifex means, Pontifex would mean, I guess, a bridge. And every pope is referred to as a successor to Peter. Pope Francis isn't called the successor to Benedict, and Benedict wasn't called successor to John Paul. So that's how we have. Any questions about this? Any more comments? Look at this chart later if you want. So next week we have, actually Father Ryan is coming in to talk about Jesus Christ. That'll be good.
That'll be good. Father Ryan's good.